Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome back to another new episode of The Lager Line, again served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. I'm your host, Ben Dubose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire and contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. I'm joined by my co-host, good friend, and producer out of Portugal, Paulo Alves, who you can follow on Twitter/X at Paulo Alves NBA. Me, I'm at Ben Dubose. So as we chat this second week of April, it's been, at best, a mixed bag for the Rockets since our last recording. They've lost 3 or 4 games since that recording date. At one point, they actually had a 5-game losing streak overall, which dated back to the previous week. And the Rockets were officially eliminated from postseason contention after that stunning collapse on Sunday in Dallas. And we don't need to get into particulars, but I can't help it because that was so frustrating. The Rockets had that game, would have been one of their best wins all season, on the road against a loaded team with Luka and Kyrie, and somehow it all slipped away when Fred VanVleet, Jabari Smith Jr. missed a combined 3 or 4 free throws in the final 30 seconds. Reggie Bullock inexplicably chose not to foul, up 3 and time running out, even after Ime Udoka has made it clear time after time that that's what he wants the Rockets to do in that situation. Then, of all people, it's Rockets legend Dante Exum burying the tying 3 as time expires. Dallas rode that momentum and won the game in overtime, and the Rockets were officially eliminated. And in the moment, it felt like an absolute gut punch, #Houston Sports, especially when you consider that the Rockets had also lost to the Mavs a week before that, and in between, they were blown out by the Warriors in a game that we had all hyped up for weeks. So at the time, it felt awful, and the terrible officiating in that Dallas game, which you called out on your timeline, Paolo, largely tilted towards the Mavs, that certainly did not help matters. But with all that said, what I've found as the days have progressed, and Paolo, I'm curious if you feel the same way, is that when I take off the emotional fan hat and put on the, let's call it a logical analyst cap, when I make that change and I zoom out, I actually don't feel that bad about any of it, especially if the Rockets can finish the season strong and hopefully get to a 500 record or even a winning record if they win all 3 games of this upcoming road trip to finish the season. Here's how I'm contextualizing everything. So with those 5 straight losses coming off the 11-game winning streak, I think you've got to toss out the Miami game last Friday. Second night of a back-to-back, right after the Warriors game that they had put their heart and souls into. That was the most obvious scheduled loss you'll ever see. They also didn't have Amen Thompson that game, minor ankle injury, and that's on top of being without Alperen Şengün and Tari Eason, which I know those have been baked in for weeks or months, but they're still quite relevant. And then you combine that with a insanely disciplined, super structured team like Miami, led by Jimmy Butler, Eric Spoelstra. They're fighting to lock up a playoff seed. This is the result you get. So if you exclude the Miami game, and again, I'm holding off discussion of Golden State for just a minute, you had 3 other games out of those 5, all against Western Conference contenders. You basically had a home-and-home series with Dallas and a road game at Minnesota. You were within 1 in Minnesota with a minute left. You had that Dallas road game won before the ridiculous collapse that we were just describing. Now, the Dallas home game was not nearly as close, but as we discussed last week, if Luka and their shooters are all going to be that on fire simultaneously, there's pretty much nothing that anybody can do. There's a reason why the Mavs won by nearly 40 in Sacramento less than a week before that. When they're on to that extent, you just sort of have to tip your cap. And so the reason I bring all that up is to say that for the most part, even when the Rockets were losing those games, I feel like the process was pretty good. They were playing hard, they were executing, they were disciplined, they were engaged. It wasn't like they just fell off a cliff from the form they had when they were winning 11 straight. They just had some coin flip games finally go against them, which that sucks, but it happens from time to time, and even more so with young teams. It's not at all like that fraudulent 7-game Gary Bird streak from a couple of years ago where as soon as it ended, it was pretty obvious they were right back to where they always were and that it was fluky. This time, they were still good in the aftermath of the streak. They just got beat in close games by other good teams in a tough part of the schedule. It happens. Now, the one exception is that Golden State game. I will acknowledge that. Ime lit into the Rockets afterward. He called them soft or scarce, said they looked like a deer in the headlights to start off, and I think it was all deserved. But, and we've made this point plenty in recent weeks, this is exactly why it was so important for the Rockets to get to a game like that this season. The intensity is higher, especially when you're going up against, in this case, a 4-time championship team. And also in the most predictable development of all time, Klay Thompson, for like the 69th time, managed to somehow turn Toyota Center into his personal fountain of youth again. That's getting absolutely ridiculous. But even aside from that angle, I will acknowledge, disappointing game from a Houston perspective, but that does happen for young teams when it's their first crack at playoff contention. This is not the first time, it won't be the last. And it's especially the case if you're going up against one of the most experienced, battle-tested teams in the entire NBA. The point of this, and we've said it all year, is that you learn from that experience, even if it goes poorly, because now you know what to expect when that situation comes up again in future years. If we're right back in this same spot in March and April of 2025, it won't be all new. That was always the point of having this season be meaningful into April, which it was. And also, in fairness to the Rockets, there were a lot of things they did wrong, but let's be clear, it's not like the Warriors are just beating up on them. They've won 8 of 9 games now. The only loss was by 2 in Dallas on night 2 of a road back-to-back. They crushed the Lakers in LA the other night with LeBron playing. They won both ends of the back-to-back in Miami and Orlando, which, as we said last week, we knew that was pretty much the fatal blow when it came to any realistic scenario for the Rockets to make a postseason push. Yes, the Warriors are still technically the number 10 seed, but give me a break. That's just a product of a historically loaded Western Conference. They've already got 44 wins going into this closing 3-game stretch. To compare to the East, Milwaukee is the number 2 seed, and they have 48 wins. So I mentioned all that context to say that for me, when you strip away the emotional fan components, I get why a young and still somewhat shorthanded Rockets team would lose those games in those settings. Now, that doesn't mean they can check out on the season. To circle back to something I said a couple of minutes ago, that's where this final week comes into play. They got off to a good start Tuesday by beating a good Orlando team, which still ranks in the top 4 of the East, and that puts the Rockets now at 39-40, entering this 3-game road trip. Win 2 of the 3, you finish at 500, and if you win all 3, you finish with a winning record. As I've said before, I do think there are some prestige benefits to finishing at 500 or better. The NBA is a perception-driven league, and if there's a true superstar that hits the trade market this summer, of course the Rockets will do their due diligence, and they do have some solid trade assets between the young core in place and their future draft assets from Brooklyn. I don't know if this summer will be the right time for that type of blockbuster trade. I don't know if the right guy will be available, but it's certainly not implausible. And if you go from a team that's basically been last place in the West for 3 straight years at roughly 20 wins per season to more than doubling that and being a winning team all in year 1 for Ime Udoka, I do think that superficially that resume might pop a little bit more relative to finishing at 39-43 or 40-42. And if the Rockets are a winning team, then they're not that far away if you add a true superstar from legitimate contention. If you want to talk about the merits of such a move, although I think we'll talk about that more the next few weeks when we get into more off-season planning conversations. But even so, that's a more macro side of things, and that's just my gut feel. I can't fully quantify it, and let's be honest, it's not like the season becomes a quote-unquote failure if they finish 40-42. But it's the micro view where I do think there's something a little more quantifiable, because how they finish this year, in my opinion, is going to go a long way towards either validating that 11-game winning streak or conversely, that 5-game losing streak. Here's what I mean by that. If you take 3 or 4 out of these final 4 games, and they've already got the one against the Magic, the home finale, it makes it all the easier to make the case that I did a few moments ago. That is, it's the 5-game losing streak that was the outlier. You can frame it as though it was a tough scheduling stretch, you had some bad breaks, and then as soon as the schedule got more reasonable, they got right back to winning. Through that lens, the 13-2 March with the 11-game winning streak, that looks like the better representation of who the Rockets currently are, and thus what we can expect them to be next year. And with that, your young guys can head into the offseason with some extra pep in their step and whatever confidence and swagger that comes from feeling like a consistent winning team over the final 2 months. They can also point to the fact that they were 27-14 at home. That's fifth best in the West. What held them back for the season as a whole was the road record. Well, if you win 3 or 4 to close out the year, you would win 10 or 9 of your final 12 road games overall. And so it would sort of feel like that you've solved that issue as well. On the flip side, if you lose at least 2 of these 3 games on the road trip, and that puts you at 7 or 8 losses in your final 9 games, the framing of the narrative gets a lot tougher. It's not that the winning streak goes away, but as opposed to feeling like they figured things out, it looks a lot more volatile. It also might look like that the road struggles are still there, because when you look specifically at these final 3 games, Utah on Thursday, Portland on Friday, and the Clippers Sunday, when they'll probably be resting everyone because they're basically locked into the 4 seed, the Rockets are going to be favored in all of those games. Now, that's not to say that any one loss is a monumental failure. In particular, that Portland game worries me a little bit because it's night 2 of a road back-to-back. They'll probably get to their hotel at 3 or 4 a.m. local time. It's tougher than it looks. But if you lose 2 or 3, then in the micro, the final week of the season, to me, feels like an extension of last week, that 0-5 week. And then at that point, it does take at least a little bit of the shine off of what was an incredible month of March. It also puts the doubt back into the equation when it comes to, can they win on the road consistently, which I think is something that Ime is going to be stressing throughout the offseason and when they begin training camp in late September. So that's why these final 3 games, even though the Rockets have been eliminated, still have a lot of meaning for me personally. Paolo, what are your general thoughts as far as what we've learned over the past week at a team level, as well as what's still to be learned from these final 3 games upcoming?
Yeah, I think so it was expected that eventually the pendulum was going to swing the other way. The Timberwolves game, to me, it just screams, Jalen Green took you home, or helped you across the finish line in so many games closing out during the win streak. Eventually he was bound to not be able to do that. That's to me, that's what happened in the Timberwolves game. The Warriors game, you're not going to beat the Warriors if they shoot 48% from 3. It's just not. I mean, I agree with you. I didn't think the team energy was there. But at the same time, it's hard to play them when Clay and Steph are on fire and the entire team's on fire shooting 48% from 3. So I was really frustrated after that one, because that one, as it is for most Rockets fans, was personal, but such is life. The first Mavericks game, they were also shooting close to 50% from 3. Luka was hitting basically everything in the face of the earth. You can blame some of that on the defensive scheme and switching Jocko and Delon to him so frequently. That one kind of is on Udoka for me. But yeah. Then you go on to the Heat game, as you said, second half of back-to-back. To me, this game was more winnable, but then, eventually you're not going to win all of the winnable games. And the second Mavericks game was just one of the most frustrating losses of the season. You need to make 1 of 3 free throws. You have an 80% shooter at the line and close to 90% shooter at the line in Fred VanVleet, and you can't make a single one. Then you compound on that by not fouling, and you compound on that by the guy that missed the last 2 free throws. For some reason, playing like at the time, they double Luka. They double one pass away, which is not great, but it's because it's Luka. And Jabari is way too late on help. What is Jabari doing?
Why is he defending the rim?
Yeah, why is he defending Maxi Kleber or whoever it is at the rim when a 2 doesn't win the game? I'm not even that mad about not fouling, and while I do agree that most NBA teams should be fouling and they don't, and the Rockets in most occasions should be fouling and they don't, this is also a very young team, and as we saw, we had just come off of 3 straight misses at the free throw line. Depending on the guy that gets fouled, you only need to miss 1 free throw in 8 seconds of game time. You can probably get 2-3 reps of going back and forward. Maybe not 3, but 2. And are you that confident that the team was going to go 4 or 4 in those free throws? Because if they don't, then a 2 ties the game, and at that point, it's not really worth it.
Although in this case, the Mavs were out of timeouts, so
they were.
Okay. That's what tilted it more towards fouling for me. But I get your point. Is that when you're struggling from the free throw line, that does make you a little bit nervous about playing the fouling game. I get it. I think it's more just who was? I think it was Andrew Sukop that made the point on Twitter that Reggie Bullock had 5 fouls and he ended up fouling out in overtime. And I think in hindsight, of course, the way the officials were in that game, good Lord. But my guess is that as well as he was playing, he wasn't sure if he wanted to take himself out of that game. Now, the counter to that, and it's, hindsight's 2020 when you're saying this, after the fact, is if you in the game right then and there, it doesn't matter that you fouled out, the game is over. But I just think the instinct right there when a player has 5 fouls is to err on the side of letting someone else do it. And unfortunately, they set the right screen. Jabari didn't come out and help. And so by the time the screen was set, nobody after Reggie had a chance to do it. My guess is that he was hoping with 5 fouls, someone else would do the deed. And just as it turned out, no one was in place to do that. And the rest is history.
Yeah, and it was just a complete choke job by Jabari, right? At the very least, like, we should be demanding that he make the free throws, but at the very least, get them across front rim. Like, none of those had any.
Yeah, they weren't close. That was disappointing. Yeah,
like it's even if.
Although to his credit, he played really, really well. We'll talk about him later on. He played really, really well against the Magic. I know he gets fired up a little bit against Paolo, but as depressing as that was, and a little bit reminiscent of the San Antonio game at the start of the year, he bounced back the next game with a strong one against the Warriors and had a run after that. I know it's a limited silver lining because the game really sucked, but at least he sort of channels it in the right way after the fact. At least that's what I feel like.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's not something to hold against Jabari for the future. It's just frustrating at the time. And
right.
Since we're talking about a 5-game losing streak. At the time, it's done really badly.
I also suspect that some of it may be that a younger team is disproportionately harmed when there's no timeout and we can sit here and say in hindsight that, yeah, Jabari should have realized that they were up 3, not up 2. But unlike a typical situation where you have the coaching staff drilling the time and score into their ears for 3 minutes before the game resumes, because there was no timeout by Dallas, they were out of them, and it all happened on the fly. My gut tells me that there was some indecision by Jabari. Maybe he didn't fully realize the score, and that, yeah, a 2-pointer is completely inconsequential. Not saying that it's not a mistake, because it is. It's just one that I think happens more with young players if there's not a timeout.
Yeah, for sure. I think, and then to close it out on these last few games and what giving a 500 record might mean, I'm not too convinced it changes that much in terms of perception. Although I will say, like, as a fan and for the players, it should be something that they take pride in, that they, at least won as many games as they lost, if not, better than that, having a winning record. The games that they have remaining, I mean, the Blazers are tanking, and I can double check real quick if they are still in risk. Yeah, if the Spurs win a game, they can still tie the Blazers for the last spot in the West, which obviously has implications when it comes to the draft odds. So the Blazers will probably be incentivized to lose that game. And the Jazz, I don't think they can go up or down. Let me compare it with the Eastern. Yeah, they basically can't go up or down. So they may just play that game for the win. They may sit a bunch of guys. I don't know what it will be, but I think the Rockets will be more incentivized to win. Because I think that's something that Udoka is probably telling the guys, like, let's at least get a 500 record. We should be proud. We should be prideful of that. But I'm not sure how much it impacts just the perception of the team. I think the winning streak already did that, and
maybe
I think you should. One of the biggest takeaways is if the standings were cross-conference, Rockets would be in the play, and they'd be the 9th seed outright with 3 or 4 games of advantage. If they were in the East, I don't even want to see the win totals. I think, didn't we face playoff teams that were 500 in the West in the James Harden years, or am I tripping on that?
No, I think you're right. The West was generally stronger, but the discrepancy was not nearly to what it is now.
Yeah, and we also miss
the Rockets
the playoffs.
The Rockets were a 500 team themselves. That final year of Dwight Howard, when everything went wrong in 2016, they were a 500 team, 41-41, going against the top seeded Warriors. That was actually what cost the Rockets a shot at Kevin Durant. Is that they were so bad the previous year they couldn't even get a meeting, despite Harden and KD being so close. So yeah, that's a perfect example. The Rockets were a 508 seed themselves in 2016.
So yeah, I mean, compare the personnel on that team versus the personnel on this team as far as age and experience, and you get whatever you want to get. So I think that they should go 3-0. I think the last Clippers game they'll just rest people unless they have something to fight for. Even if they do, the Clippers are not the juggernaut that they they had looked like 15 games ago. And I think it would be something as a fan that you're really proud of. And it shows how much of an improvement that has been. It has reflected into winning. It's not a moral victory. And we earlier in the season said, hey, this year there's no moral victories, and that's the truth. And they have delivered. And the record, if they get to 500, won't be a moral victory. It will be something that they can hold themselves to, and they can look to build on going into next year. As far as individuals go, it's kind of sad that Jalen Green has regressed back in the shooting, but
I think the processing is still better. I think,
yeah, for sure.
yeah, it's not like a regression from earlier this season. He's still making an impact in other ways.
Yeah, I agree. But looking for him to bounce back, and yeah, as far as the last few games, it gives us something to cheer for, that we are at least close to 500. And if you look at the odds to begin the season, we've cleared our over a while
By far.
back, and I wonder what they'll set our over at next year, considering if we do get to 500.
Yeah, that's a good question. And of course, a lot of it's going to depend on what happens around the Western Conference this offseason. While I don't think there's anyone poised for an immediate regression, at the same time, some of those more veteran-laden teams, you mentioned the Clippers with obviously Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, Lakers with LeBron, Suns with KD. Those are situations where it would not take much, be it an injury, a retirement, a trade demand, for them to fall off a map and perhaps be in the same position the Rockets were in 2020 with James Harden. So even if there's not clearly a team that the Rockets can pass at the moment, it would not take much to change that calculus, and that will go into their offseason odds as well. Because, of course, if the Rockets want to be well above where they are right now, they probably need to pass someone in the West. The question is who that's likely to be. We'll dive into that more in our upcoming episodes when the season ends, and we can take a more holistic look at what we learned from this season and what the landscape looks like moving forward. As far as individuals, one guy that I wanted to discuss on today's pod is Dillon Brooks. We've talked about Jalen a lot in recent pods because, of course, his jump since the All-Star break, and especially since losing Alperen Şengün, has been a big part of the story. Not saying that it's complete by any means. There has been a bit of a shooting regression. There's also the question going into next year of, can you get both Jalen and Şengün in peak form at the same time? I think a lot of that narrative is overdone, but at the same time, until they consistently do it, there's reasons why they have not, but until they actually do it, then it's fair to wonder. And that's going to be a storyline throughout the offseason and leading into training camp in the fall. But we've discussed that plenty, and to some extent, it's almost a boring discussion because it's just, we got to wait and see what happens when we're hopefully fortunate enough to see both of these guys healthy on the same court at the same time in the fall. In terms of what's been going on in the micro, the last week, Dillon Brooks is someone who, in recent pods, we've discussed in a very negative way. Last week, we actually talked about, is he guaranteed to have a starting spot next year should he return, when you consider there's alternative options like Tari Eason and Amin Thompson as currently constructed. Since then, perhaps Dillon listened to us and took some fuel from it. Now, I know I'm just getting a big head with that comment. Dillon made the improvements through his own play. He does work very hard, and to his credit, over the last 3 games,
Wait,
he's
was
averaging
it not Rip Hamilton highlights?
Oh God, no comment. Anyway, last 3 games, nearly 21 points per game, 51% shooting, 65% from 3, on high volume at nearly 6 threes per game. Now, of course, the 65% three-point clip is not sustainable. I understand that. But the point is, it's gotten his season-long average back up to nearly 37 when he was at his best to start this season. When the Rockets got off to that great 15-12 start through Christmas, he was shooting over 40% from 3. And now we're starting to see some signs of a bounce back. And it's just been striking to me how quickly that has correlated with an upturn for the offense as a whole. And when you take a step back, it makes perfect sense, because what's happened in recent weeks, as Jalen has taken off, then defenses have committed more resources to him. And that's been part of his scoring going down a touch the last few games. He's seeing more traps. He's seeing more double teams. Against the Magic, they were also trapping and double teaming Fred VanVleet after he had a season high 37 points. And so that creates these 4-on-3 scenarios where the defense is going to funnel the ball in many of these occasions to what they view as the biggest liability. And when the Rockets were really struggling offensively, go back to the the first Mavs game and the Minnesota game, Dillon couldn't throw it in the ocean. Those 2 games, he was 1 of 11 from 3, and he had just 5 combined points. And it felt like, in these 4-on-3 scenarios, they're at a disadvantage, but as long as there's some rim protection, which the Mavs had with Gafford and the Timberwolves did with Gobert, then you can prevent an all-out rim attack. And then in terms of the shooting, the mid-range game, just funnel it to the guy that you view as the biggest liability, and that was Dillon Brooks. As soon as he started perking back up against the Heat in the second Mavs game, where he was outstanding, season-high 29 points, and followed it up with 50% shooting, 3 or 4 from 3 in that 12-point win over the Magic, all of a sudden the offense looks completely different. And I think that's sort of the natural evolution of what we've been looking for from the Rockets this year. Because to start this season, I think everyone knew going in that Fred was going to be a good point guard, a clear positive as an offensive player. Not a superstar, but a very good player. Beyond that, you were hoping for some of your young guys to take that leap. And while not at the same time, they have. Alperen Sengun became a guy that commanded double teams and got you advantage scenarios with the way he played over the first 60-plus games. Now, over the last 20 or so, Jalen has evolved into one of those guys as well. And when you combine that with Fred, you've got guys that can generate advantages. You've got guys that strike fear in the hearts of opposing defenses in a way that you didn't know you had going into this season. You were hopeful you would have it, but you didn't know. Now you do. And so with defenses adjusting, since the Rockets actually do have offensive players that put some fear into opposing coaches when they're putting together their game plans, then that makes it all the more important for you not to have a clear liability somewhere else. And the other 2 spots are Dillon Brooks and Jabari Smith Jr. And I focus on Dillon more because Jabari, for the most part, even though he's had certain stretches where he doesn't shoot the ball well, I feel like generally he's respected as a shooter. Dillon, it's a little more hit or miss in terms of how he's playing over the preceding few games as to how I feel like opposing defenses view him. And there's also historically the issues that Dillon has with shot selection, where you can potentially bait him into doing some dumb things in a way that for the most part, teams haven't been able to do with Jabari. And so that's why I think Dillon in particular has sort of been an X factor, a key variable. And it's not just Dillon. I mean, it's his role. The same could be said, I think, if you threw Tari Eason into that slot or Amin Thompson, whoever it would happen to be going into next season. The point is the next evolution, now that Sengun and Jalen have consistently been able to generate these advantages, to bring help defenders, to get traps and doubles on occasion. We know what Fred can do. He's established. So that puts a lot more pressure on those other 2 spots, and Dillon in particular, to hold up their weight, to not be a liability. So I've got some theories about how you can unlock Dillon specifically, but I just think it's sort of a holistic level. What these last few games have really underscored for me is just how important it is not to have an offensive zero at that spot with the way the Rockets are currently constructed. Now, maybe that changes a little bit if you have 2 clear advantage generators at the same time, i.e. both Jalen and Sengun. Hopefully, we're lucky enough to see that play out in the fall. But for now, what these past few games, I guess the bad of a couple of weeks ago when Dillon was dreadful, and now the good of the last 3 games, what it's really hit home for me is that role is really important to them offensively. When you're getting made threes out of that position and confident rim attacks out of closeouts, and the Rockets are humming offensively. When they're not, it gets ugly because defenses just leave that guy to shoot and fire away. And if he misses, it gets sticky. And now you can't get the space for Jalen to operate either. So before we get into Dillon specifically, I guess the angle I want to attack, does it make sense to you that with where the Rockets are now and their rebuilding cycle, the development of these young prospects, that those non-creation positions, that's what I'm going to call it, with Dillon and Jabari, are the really important ones when it comes to the upside of the offense? Does that make sense to you?
I see what you're trying to say. I think our advantage creators are not consistent enough yet. Although maybe that is and basketball is a zero-sum game. Maybe they're not as consistent because the other pieces are not drawing enough attention to make it easier for them to create the advantages, because it's not, you create the advantages, then it's not, the cycle is, it is a cycle. It's not a two separate things. So one impacts the other. But I mean, the thing with Dylan is that he's actually, so you get ups and downs, right? But he's actually a fairly gifted offensive player as far as what he can do at his peak versus what he can't do when he's, playing badly offensively. So it's not a Robert Covington situation where you pretty much know what to expect, right? And it's more consistent. When Dylan's firing on all cylinders, he can drive, he can finish through contact, he can hit the threes. He can sometimes step back from three. He can hit some mid-range shots, right? So
Even as a post game.
Yeah, when he's playing well, he's not just a role player. When Robert Covington's playing well, he might shoot seven
He's still a
threes
role
and make
player.
six of them, right? And
Fair
he'll impact the game,
Yeah.
but it's different. So Dylan's more of a shooting guard type in his offensive game. Now, obviously, that impacts the team a lot. But to me, it's more. Not only did we lose offensively what he was bringing earlier in the season, defensively, we became a less gritty of a team because he wasn't able to defend the way he was defending earlier in the season. To me, earlier in the season, he was one of the best defenders in the NBA, and right now, I'm not even sure he's average. So to me, the more important thing is, can he bring the defensive side of of his brilliance back, rather than the offense, because I think the gap between what he was defensively to begin the season and what he's defensively now is, even regardless of the last three games, what he was to begin the season versus what he is now is larger on defense than what it is on offense. I think, yes, he was, on fire from three, and he was, one of the most efficient players in the league for a few months, but he regressed, but he was still, half decent. And I think on defense now, he's fouling more. He's falling asleep on rotations more. He gets getting beat off the dribble by guys that he should not be getting beat off the dribble by. And I'm not even talking about stars. I'm talking about, Joe Ingles types and Josh Giddey types that should really have no chance to score against them. So to me, it will be more important to get back the Dylan that we had as a defender.
And maybe the oblique injury plays into it. That's the hope. But I get your point. Yeah.
Yeah, and because as a communicator, that's really important, and as a non-ball defender, and as someone who makes up for the mental lapses that some of our players have, even if they're good defenders or even if they're playing good defense, was being a connector defensively was really important for our success defensively early on. Offensively, listen, if he can bring that back, obviously that's good, that's great. But regardless, I think going into the offseason, I'm not saying you should trade him, but I think he is, with Fred VanVleet playing as well as he is, and being hard to move unless it is for a star. And I know we won't get into this episode, but he is the guy that's easier to move if you're seeking an upgrade, because the Rockets' rotation has 6 guys locked into it, which are the 6 young guys. Has Fred VanVleet, that's 7 guys. Dylan is the 8th guy that's going to get real minutes, and amongst this group, he is not really the odd man out because he's good, right? But the easier one to upgrade without sacrificing future upside. So if you wanted to
replace internally, if you're doing a package,
yeah. So if you wanted to trade for someone, or if you in the Rockets have an asset that they'll have to make a decision on, whether they like it or not, in the Brooklyn pick, the one that makes more sense to explore will probably be the one plus that. And obviously, he has the longer contract. Rafael Stone has said multiple times that he's big on optionality. He is the guy that has the least optionality from a move standpoint.
Yeah. And his salary in the 20s, other than Fred, who I think they want to keep for a number of reasons, that's the only salary they currently have above 15 million. So if you're trying to make a big trade, you almost have to have him be viewed as positive trade value, as we were discussing, I believe, last week. That's so important to them because otherwise it's really difficult to make the math work. A little easier in the offseason where you can aggregate 5-6 guys because of expanded rosters and whatnot. But yeah, you probably need Dylan for math reasons and because he's more easy to replace internally it would just make sense for him to be in those trades. But again, we can talk more about that in future pods. For now, I want to focus on the scenario where he comes back, because I do think it's been a big part of their story over the past week, this offensive resurgence that we've seen, even against an Orlando team that's pretty good defensively. When you have the good Dillon offensively, it transforms what you can do. And it's been refreshing. I mentioned, we talk about his value. Now that he's shooting above 43% overall, 37% on threes, all of a sudden he looks a lot more palatable to other teams around the league this offseason, potentially. Again, we'll table that for now. But even in the very micro, he is helping them win games. He was the turnaround against Orlando, and he's honestly the biggest reason why they should have won at Dallas. Not his fault that they couldn't get that foul and Fred and Jabari missed the free throws. We don't need to go into that again. As far as the reasons why, besides the obvious of he's making more shots, there have been a couple of interesting comments to me that were made first by Dillon and then by Ime Udoka. So after that Dallas game, he mentioned that he wanted to get back to what he called his old style of playing defense. Paraphrasing here, but he thinks he changed a bit when he got to Houston because the NBA was watching him in terms of the extracurriculars, the fouls, the fines, the suspensions. And he said that after the Dallas game because while the defense by and large has regressed ever since the oblique injury, I do think he was better on Sunday. Now, he did get into foul trouble against the Mavs, but I think a lot of that was that the whistle was just comically biased in Dallas's favor. I think he took that Luka assignment personally, and that helped him be a lot more dialed in. He didn't have the lapses that he often has, especially off the ball in recent weeks. And so I asked Ime Udoka about those comments in the context of what we've seen from Dillon lately. And predictably, Ime did not touch on the league aspect because I just don't think Ime wants to put his player in a bad position with the league by saying, oh, we think the league is biased against it. No, even if that's true, and I think there is some truth in that, I don't think the Rockets, it's not to their advantage to play up that angle. However, he did touch on what he thinks Dillon meant by getting back to who he was in Memphis. And the distinction that Ime drew was that in Memphis, Dillon was primarily a matchup defender in that he would often get tasked with guarding the opposing team's best perimeter player, on occasion the best post player, and that was his guy. And even if there were screens set, then it was his job to navigate those, go over the top, power through them, whatever it may be. He was responsible for LeBron James or whoever it might be. And we've seen that at times this season. He did a good job against Wemby, the two Rocket Spurs matchups, even though he was undersized from a length perspective, made up for it with his strong physical presence, his active hands. We saw him do a pretty good job, especially off ball against Luka on Sunday. I was impressed by what he did there. Basically took Luka out of the game in the fourth quarter and made it a Kyrie show. Unfortunately, Kyrie did take advantage, but Dillon did what he did in the Luka matchup. And I think he feeds off of that. Unfortunately, as Ime said, the Rockets prioritize switching in their scheme. And it makes sense because the Rockets, when healthy, do have a lot more capable defenders who also have guys like Tari Eason, like Jabari Smith Jr., like Amen Thompson, who are capable of holding their own when there are these switches. So especially in this period with Alperen Şengün out, it doesn't make sense to ask one guy to fight through everything to stick with his matchup. The Rockets have multiple guys capable of defending top scorers, top playmakers on the perimeter, so they want to take advantage of that and not put themselves in a disadvantaged position when the primary guy is trying to recover from having a screen set on him. And so while Ime did not explicitly spell it out, what Ime is hinting at there is that Dillon can get a little disengaged when he's not responsible for his man. Another good example, I mentioned Wemby and Luka. Also, the Chicago game against DeMar DeRozan before both were ejected. That was a game where Dillon did a really good job against DeMar, who's unquestionably the top perimeter guy on Chicago. And what's interesting about these games, it's not just that Dillon's defense was improved, which I think it was, but these were also games where he played well offensively as well. It reminds me a little bit of, in baseball, you'll see these splits where certain players, for whatever reason, and this was the case with Yainer Diaz at the Astros last year, hit way better when they're in the lineup defensively than they do as a DH. And that's completely counter to what you would think because it makes sense that if a player can just focus on hitting, then it should make it even easier for them to do that job. But what many players will tell you, and I think Diaz alluded to this a couple of times, is that it's easier for him to hit when he's catching because he feels more engaged. He's more in the game. There's not all that time off. And so with Dylan, when I see him have these games, and Chicago against DeRozan, before he got thrown out, that was one of the games where he shot really well. We saw what he did against the Mavs on Sunday. Not only is Dylan defending at a higher level, it also seems to bring out a better version of him offensively. He just seems to have his competitive fire back. So Ime acknowledged that at the conclusion of his comments. He said that may be something we revisit in the off season, because obviously you're not going to change your defensive principles on the fly in regards to how much do you switch. Are there exceptions to that switching rule, and so on and so forth? No, if you're going to do something like that, it's in the off season. You don't do that with just a few games left to play as you're playing out the string. That could be an option. Another option I've thought about, and it doesn't necessarily have to be benching Dylan. Maybe it can just be reducing his minutes from, I believe he's averaging 31 minutes per game now. Maybe you lower him to 25 next year, even if he's still starting. And that way, if you're not asking him to play 30 plus minutes, then the fouls are less of a big deal because he's not going to get himself into foul trouble, or he's less likely to get himself into foul trouble if he's playing fewer minutes. So maybe that helps him play more aggressively. Maybe even if you're still doing the switching with Dylan, he can sort of feel like the old Dylan if you give him more freedom to play aggressively, to play physically. But I guess what I'm struck by with this improvement, I'm curious your perspective, Paolo. What it feels like Ime is hinting at is that the Rockets know that, and I think this is what Dylan's saying as well, that they get the best out of Dylan on both ends when he feels the freedom that he had for most of his time in Memphis. That went away towards the end of the Grizzlies' tenure with all the extracurricular stuff. We saw it at times this year, but between Houston having different defensive principles and then the oblique injury and then a number of mouths to feed, for whatever reason, it felt like Dylan got away from that. He wants to get back to it. The question is, how can the Rockets blend that with what makes the most sense for them as a team? So I guess my questions for you, Paolo. First, do you buy the potential correlation that if you let Dylan be Dylan, so to speak, I think of let Russ be Russ, which is what all the Westbrook stands said for years. Let's, in this case, say let Dylan be Dylan. Do you buy there's a correlation that might help him also be better offensively? And if so, what is sort of a realistic compromise that you can do when you're mapping out how to potentially use him next season to best tie into that?
I mean, potentially, right? We've seen weirder things in sports. It's if it gets him into a state of mind when he's more locked in and he needs that to get into it. We've seen weirder things in sports, right? I do believe that may have an impact, if nothing else, just inside his head, and then that translates onto the court. I mean, I think that the better question is he worth accommodating that, considering the Rockets' current personnel, as you said, which has a lot of lengthy defenders that are ideally switching. I think without Brent Shingun, perhaps it's worth it. I think without LB, perhaps it's not. It depends on if you can achieve, if you have a five that can defend better at the rim and switch better, then perhaps it's more worth it to play a switching scheme, and you can freely switch across all five positions or close to it. And perhaps there the reward for having Dylan do what Dylan does is less appealing. Now, I think that's, I think, as I said, it becomes an even tougher decision because of Dylan's status in the pecking order as far as how useful he is to the team now and going forward, and how, there's so many guys ahead of him that he may get traded. I think if a guy like Mikal Bridges doesn't have or doesn't need that type of incentive defensively to play well offensively, maybe it really makes sense. But I think for now, just going with the status quo without Bridges in the lineup, I think it's worth it to let Dylan have the best matchup, and you take it away if you see that it's not paying off or that he's having an off night offensively anyways, and you do have a game plan and you want to stick to the game plan, but you want to be flexible enough because you have so many good defenders on the roster. If Amen Thompson's playing, even more so if both Amen and Tari are playing, you can have a little bit of a longer leash or of a shorter leash with Dylan as to hey, initially we're going to put you on LeBron James, or initially we're going to put you on Luka Doncic. But if it starts to go poorly, either you can't guard them effectively enough, or offensively you're not delivering the results that you say you should be able to, because you're getting to guard the best guy, then you change the approach. But as I said, I don't think, I said on the previous pod, that I don't think they'll change the starting lineup going to next season. I think Dylan will hold on to it at least for the start. So assuming that that's going to happen, you can have both a shorter leash from a game-to-game basis and within a game. So from a game-to-game basis in the starting lineup and within the game with who you have guarding the primary guy. And the other thing that you can do is you can play him less minutes.
Exactly, and that may happen anyway because you got to find minutes for Tari, you got to find more minutes for Amen Thompson and Cam Whitmore. So beyond the incentive to get more out of Dylan by letting him play more physically, can't be in, well, it's harder to be in foul trouble if you're playing mid 20s as opposed to low 30s. It also benefits the Rockets in other ways. So perhaps it's something that was already happening, and this just happens to be an additional benefit of it.
Yeah, and besides that, you can also, I probably point to Amen Thompson. You can probably stagger him and Amen the most that you can, so that you have one of them on the floor at all times to guard the best player. And I say Amen over Tari, not because Amen is necessarily a better defender. I think they're actually pretty close to each other on ball, but because of also the shooting that shooting concerns that come with Amen. You'd rather probably, since Dylan is a questionable shooter, you'd probably rather have Tari next to him if you have to choose between having Amen next to him or Tari next to him in the same lineup. But besides that, I mean, if that's not enough or that's not working, as I said, he's the least hard guy to trade out of this team.
Good point. All right, the last guy I want to get to before we wrap up today's pod. So, as mentioned, Dylan is the biggest X factor when it comes to the team as it's constructed going into next season, because while not consistent, you have seen much more consistent relative to the past flashes of both Şengün and Jalen being guys that can create advantages for their teammates. And Fred, I don't want to say he consistently generates that, but he's a very good player on a regular basis. He is who he is. And so there are fewer questions when it comes to the offensive foundation of this team than there were 80 games ago. That's my biggest takeaway. And so now that you're getting more clarity with your upper echelon scoring and playmaking slots, then that puts more pressure as they draw more attention on these other spots, these other guys, to not be liabilities because they're much more likely to get open shots and get advantage scenarios out of the attention drawn from guys like Jalen Green, Alperen Şengün, and Fred VanVleet. So amongst your starters, we've covered Dylan. Another guy that I think is very interesting right now, and he's the one starter we haven't talked about a lot on today's show, is Jabari Smith Jr. As mentioned, I don't think he's quite the variable that Dylan is, simply because he doesn't have quite the same dimension to his offensive game, at least not yet, that Dylan does when he's right. He also doesn't have the bad shot selection game, if you will, so his lows aren't as low. But at the same time, he's one of those two other guys that oftentimes does get advantage scenarios based on the attention drawn from his teammates. And the good news is that Jabari has generally been taking advantage of those. Over the 14 games since Alperen Şengün went down and Jabari slid to center, he's averaging more than 16 points per game on nearly 49% shooting and 41% from three. That's terrific. Now, the rebounding has gone down a tick, and there absolutely have been matchups, the Warriors in particular, where his liabilities as a rebounder, as a rim protector, make it very difficult to run him at the five for an extended basis. That's true, but we already knew that. The Jabari at the five lineup, it's not something the Rockets ever planned on leaning into just full time over 82 games. It's something that's meant for small doses, like a smaller version of what the Rockets or what the Warriors did, with Draymond Green and their death lineups over the years. It's something you're going to be able to strategically deploy in certain matchups, in certain situations. It's not something that you can realistically expect him to take on the wear and tear, the pounding that it takes from asking a 6'10", 220 something pound second year player, still just 20 years old, to take on against NBA centers. And there have been games during this recent swoon, the 5 straight losses a week or so ago, where we saw Jabari get taken advantage of, most notably the Golden State game against their stable of bigs, including Draymond Green. With that said, offensively, there have been certain advantages. And if you could deploy that on a smaller scale, especially next season where you're going to have Alperen Şengün and Steven Adams available to soak up more minutes at center, then there are some real advantages to that lineup. You have to deploy it at the right time and place, but assuming you do that, then I don't think you can deny these numbers. And it's getting better and better. Over the last 8 games, he scored in double figures in all of them, averaging nearly 19 per game on true shooting of better than 63%. So at least on the offensive end of the court, it seems to be flowing really well for him. There's also more space for him to drive against guys who often aren't the most fleet of foot. We actually saw against the Magic, Jabari had a really nifty move where he attacked the closeout and then had a Euro step on his way to the basket that I didn't realize he had in his bag. That was really impressive. But the one question I have when it comes to next season, how much of this is just growth from Jabari as a player? He is year 2. He is 20 years old. He's number 3 overall pick from a year ago. He should be getting better. And how much of it is the situation and that you are using him offensively at the 5 so he has these certain advantages? That to me is an interesting question going into the offseason, because for the most part next year, I think you're going to want to use him at the 4 because the vast majority of your minutes at center, assuming you run it back, and I think that's the odds-on likely scenario, are going to be covered by Alperen Şengün and Steven Adams. And I'm wondering if that takes a toll on what we've seen from him over the last 15 games or so. And beyond just the overall there being less space when you have a traditional big man, I'll give you another example of how it could impact Jabari specifically. One way that he's been very useful to them the last few weeks is in busting the zones. You've seen more teams try to pack the paint with these zone defenses as Jalen has gotten better at attacking the rim, at passing out of those advantages. Then you're seeing teams go to a zone to make it tougher for him to get to the rim. Well, the way the Rockets are busting that many times, they're getting Jabari to the free throw line extended area, and he's buried a number of those jumpers, and it makes the defense hesitate to commit as aggressively to that zone. If you have Alperen Şengün on the floor, he's typically operating in that area as sort of a mid-post hub to either create a shot for himself or for one of his teammates. And you're seeing Jabari either in the corner or on the wing, more as a shooter, as opposed to someone that's sort of flashing to the middle of the court, and you're asking to be more aggressive, searching for his shot. So I'm not going to say that everything that Jabari has done well offensively is due to him being used primarily as a 5. I do think there's some element to him just simply developing and playing better, which should happen at his age. But I do worry a little bit that it might not be a seamless fit when you shift him back to the role he had for most of this season. Paolo, where are you at when it comes to those dynamics, i.e. how much of this improved play, because we can't deny it, Jabari, the end of the Dallas game excluded, is definitely playing better ball. This is really encouraging. How much of it is the way he's being used, which definitely has some limitations defensively that are not sustainable over a super long sample, and how much of it is just he's playing better ball, and that should translate even if he's at the 4?
I'd give it a 90-10 split.
Okay.
Agreeing with you. I think 90% of it is just a completely different role. I think we're seeing him run more pick and pop, which I barely remember seeing at all when Şengün was around. I think he gets more opportunities for second chance points as a result of not having someone else, be there for offensive rebounds. I think he gets more, just there's more situations where for some reason he has a little bit of extra space, even if he's not at the rim. He's, 3, 4, 5 feet from it, and he just gets the ball and happens to have a much smaller defender on him as a result of bunch of switches and whatever chaos happens in the offense, and he gets, more reps from there. I also think that the Rockets have, lower quality offensive possessions as far as creating an advantage reliably since Şengün was being gone. I don't think that's a hot take at all. And as a result, as a 6'10", 6'11" guy who can shoot over everybody, Jabari is going to have more reps just as a, I'm missing the layer. I'm not the layer. I'm missing the expression, but as a guy that can just get a shot, and that shot's likely going, like a contested shot from Jabari is likely going to be a better shot than a contested shot from anybody else.
Yeah.
It's not. It has something to do with cork or something. It's about as a release valve. Let's call it that.
Okay.
I can't believe I just said it has to do with cork. Whatever. So I think he gets more shots as a result of that, and just as a result of having one less off, and besides all of those specific circumstances, just having one less offensive creator on the floor leads to those reps being distributed equally, not equally, but to some extent across the rest of the members of the team. The guy that replaced Şengün is Amen Thompson, who has some possessions rolling, gets some offensive rebounds, but for the most part not initiating. It's not being trusted with much creation on the ball, outside of the extra possessions that it does generate, or the opportunities rolling to the rim. And so Jabari gets more shots because of it. The 10% is, yes, I think he's shooting better than he was shooting earlier in the season. Some of that comes from rhythm as well. Some of that comes from him just, becoming a better player. And with Jabari, the development has been fairly linear offensively, even though defensively, sometimes he just has those games where he's all over the place, in a bad way. Offensively, I think it's been a pretty steady growth. He finished last season with that stretch that was really hot, and he's been getting better. Earlier this season, he has never been inefficient, and now he keeps climbing, and now is being tremendously efficient. But it doesn't feel like it's completely unsustainable the way Dylan Brooks' extreme efficiency compared to his standards feels like, because it feels like Jabari's good enough that he could at some point shoot 50, 40, 90. For maybe the 90 part's a tougher one, but he could shoot 50, 40, 90 at some point in his career, especially if he's playing the 5, and that the field goal percentage is getting bumped up from all of the layups, the extra layups that he'll get compared to a guy that plays the 4. So yeah, I think most of it comes from the offensive role that he's playing, rather than just the steady growth that I have been talking about. And you could next off season, make it a point to run more pick and pop. It's hard to do that with Şengün if he doesn't have a jump shot. You could make it up, and I don't think Jabari is much of a movement shooter. Pick and pop is one thing. He's moving, but he's facing the basket. He can set up for the shot beforehand before he catches the ball. It's one thing. Movement shooting coming off a screen, right? When he's running sideways and has to square up and hit the shot in one full movement. To me, I think Jabari struggles with. His jump shot is still weirdly inconsistent, not from a percentage standpoint, but from where the misses go standpoint, right? It feels like sometimes it's just completely off, and then he'll make 2 in a row.
I know what you mean.
So it's not like he's constantly missing by a little bit and then they start to go in. So it's a weird case. I think I think most of the extra reps that he's getting come, and I know this is a forbidden word, organically from
By the way,
from
happy 1-year Steven Silas dismissal anniversary.
damn, wasn't that the biggest move the biggest move of the offseason? And for real, I
Yeah.
think that's not what we're trying to discuss. I think it's bigger than Fred. It's bigger than Amen or Cam, and it's bigger than Dylan Brooks for sure. And it's bigger than any internal development that there has been, even though Ime obviously contributed.
Yeah. By the way, I thought it was telling that Jalen in his post-game interview after the home finale referenced the bad habits that needed to break. He wasn't explicitly throwing Steven under the bus, but it wasn't a strong endorsement either. Let's put it that way.
I mean, I think everybody, I think if there's only one person in the world that doesn't believe that the problem was largely Steven Silas, that the talent was there. And I mean, the players have been over time pretty transparent about how bad it was when it comes to bad habits in the first 2 years. And Jalen improving, and if he can build on it into next season, consistently improving, is as big of a say has as big of a say on what Steven Silas was doing as anybody could ever do, because he was the guy that was the most exposed to the coaching. He was the guy that was the most exposed to having on-ball reps while Silas was here and just getting to do whatever it was. So I don't wanna
To sum up
I-
with Jabari, because I think our views are largely in alignment here. It's not that there's no growth. There is some growth. He is getting better. Tip your hat. But just as there are questions with Jalen and Şengün, there's going to have to be some blending of their games. There's also going to have to be some blending, some tweaks that occur to sustain this version of Jabari if you put him back at power forward and play him next to Alperen Şengün and Steven Adams. To look at the data, by the way, looking at Basketball Reference, they tracked Jabari at 88% power forward, 12% center his rookie year. This year, it's 68% power forward, 32% center. Obviously, tilted a lot based on the last month. And so it's not to say that the growth isn't real. It is. It's just that he's being used in a certain way, and to have that sustainable in a different configuration, i.e. next to Şengün or Steven Adams, then you may need to tweak some things in terms of your offensive schemes to play to his strengths. And the other part of it too, it's not to say that there's no benefit to him showing you that he can do it when used this way. You can also hunt certain matchups over an NBA season where you think, hey, this is a good spot for Jabari at the 5, or we can really benefit from his increased offense without being punished by the fact that he's not much of a rim protector or a big time rebounder. That's something that over the last month, you sort of had to take the good with the bad, and that because there's not really any other option at center other than Jock Landale. It feels like he's capped at about 25 minutes per game for obvious reasons. You sort of had to sink or swim, even if the matchup wasn't good. Whereas in the future, you sort of have this in your back pocket, knowing, okay, you can get this version of Jabari, but we just want it to be in a matchup where he's not going to get harmed that much defensively, that you're not going to give up on defense what you're gaining on offense. And so there's some value to that as well, right?
Yeah, and the versatility is huge moving forward. If Jabari can become a viable option at the 5, even if you don't do it, full time, we've seen when we were in the playoffs how valuable it is to have players to switch up defensive schemes. And if you can't handle a guy like Gobert, or if you can't handle a guy like Jokic, nobody can handle, but you can try to, rather than play the opponent's game, you can try to leverage, change your scheme and leverage just different strengths and hope that your strength overpowers the opponent's. So it's definitely a good thing. And I think people may have looked at the segment and said, oh, these guys are suggesting that possibly Jabari could replace Şengün as the 5. I actually don't think so at all. I think Jabari is pretty far away from being a reliable 5, even in a switching scheme. And it's good that it's progressing towards being 1 eventually, but I think we're pretty far away from it.
Yeah, what I was trying to get at, and I think we're largely in alignment, it's more of a cautionary tale that I don't think you should extrapolate what's happened over the last 15 games and say this is 100% who he is now, even if you drop him back to power forward in the same role he was in earlier this year. It's not automatically going to translate at the same level. Now, with that said, there are tweaks that you can make offensively to your schemes to play into that more. You mentioned the increased pick and pop. There's also the ability to roll with this Jabari at the 5 lineup on select occasions when it might not be as much of a liability in terms of your bulk around the basket, your rim protection, if you will. For me, the point of this segment was more just a cautionary tale. It's say, hey, like Jabari has improved. This is great. But just keep in mind going into next season that just as there are questions with, okay, Jalen Green was used in this way after Şengün went out, how is this exactly going to translate when everybody's healthy? Then there's also questions to a lesser extent with Jabari as well. Now, these are good questions because these are very talented players, and you'd much rather have too many talented players that you're trying to all fit together and blend their games than the alternative. It's just, these are just little questions that I think Ime Udoka and his staff are going to have to ask themselves over the offseason, right? That's basically the way that I'm framing this.
No, I'm 100% in alignment. I just wanted to make it clear because there's a section of the fan base that's very sensitive to it. I don't think by saying that this is the reason Jabari is playing better, I'm not saying it's worth it for the team to move into a Jabari at the 5 full-time scheme.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I'm trying to say both Şengün and Steven Adams. It's nothing against Şengün's style of play specifically. It's about the concept of a traditional big man anyway, and how Jabari's current game blends with that on the court with the current Rockets. And some of the limitations, again, Alperen Şengün could not be on the floor. You could put Steven Adams on there instead, and you would still have many of the same issues. And so, yeah, it's not a Şengün faction, but I totally understand your point. There is a segment of, at least on social media, the Rockets fan base that will take anything as a perceived slight to Alperen Şengün. That's not what this is. This is more talking about the specific improvements in Jabari Smith Jr.'s game and how the Rockets can unlock more of those heading into next season. All right, that's where we'll put a bow on this episode. We've gone on long enough, so we'll be back next week after the season is concluded. That's when we'll go into, I think, much more of a macro discussion, talking about the roster that the Rockets have going into the offseason, any potential changes, big or small. Rockets are also going to most likely have a top 10 draft pick headed their way from Brooklyn. We'll see where that ends up in the draft order once the Nets finish their season as well on Sunday. We'll start doing some draft coverage in the coming weeks if the Rockets end up keeping that pick, although I'm sure they will at least explore trades on the trade market. This is not a situation where the Rockets really want to wait a long time. They're definitely in a win now place. If, as is, you're already at 40-ish wins and you have a young core that's continuing to get better, and conceivably you could add a big piece externally, yeah, this thing could accelerate really, really quickly. So it's definitely going to be an offseason where I'm not going to promise that a big deal is made, but the Rockets will definitely leave no stone unturned, pardon the Rafael Stone pun there, as they look to upgrade the roster and perhaps accelerate this timetable even more. Because I don't think we necessarily expected to be where the Rockets are going into this season. I don't think we would have expected 500 this late, but that's where they are, despite the over-under total being 31.5. So perhaps making expedite the timeline even more this offseason with a marquee move. Stay tuned. Whatever happens, we'll have it covered right here at the Logger Line. For now, this is where we will adjourn. If you want more content before our next episode, which will take place after the regular season finale, the best place to get it is on Twitter or X. I'm on there at Ben Dubose. Paolo's on there at Paolo Alves NBA. And the show is on there, the Logger Line, at the Logger Line, where if you go to that handle or twitter.com/the Logger Line and click on the link tree in the bio, you can find links to our partners, friends, sponsors, Carbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790, USA Today's Rockets Wire. Consume their content. That would help us stay on good terms with them. But also you can find links to our distributors, Apple, Google, Spotify. If you're not already subscribed to the program, please do leave us a positive review. You get the benefit of episodes as soon as they come out, and we get the review with your subscription and hopefully your happy review of looking good to those aforementioned friends, partners, and sponsors as one of the most active podcasts and hopefully one of the better podcasts covering Houston Rockets basketball. All right, with the plugs complete, this will do it for today. For Paolo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and let's go out and win these final 3 games. Go Rockets.